Welcome to the Resilience Interview. My name's John Fawcett, and today I'm talking with Lisa McKay, who's a psychologist, a writer, and founder of the long-distance relationship website Modern Love Long Distance. She specializes in teaching humanitarian workers about resilience, stress, and trauma. She's also published a novel, a memoir, and numerous essays. She currently lives in Port Vila, Vanuatu, with her husband and her 2 sons. Lisa, thanks really much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I love talking about this sort of stuff. So this is fun for me.
Oh, good, great. Well, I'm really interested to hear from you because you and I have known each other for a while, but I want to try and see if we can get at something about resilience. And so let me start off right by, what do you find most interesting about the whole idea of resilience?
Oh gosh, I find it one of the things I find fascinating is that it took so long for the field of psychology in general to shift towards looking at resilience. I've been a psychologist now for, gosh, more than 15 years, gulp. And when I first started working in trauma and stress, that's what it was all about. It was all about trauma and stress in our work and in our practice and in the research focus. And there's been a real shift, particularly in the last 10 years, I think 10 to 12 years, of focusing more on what is working and strengths and things that feed into resilience versus what is not working. And given the power inherent in that approach, I guess I find it surprising that it took psychology as a field of practice and research that long to start to shift, and then how quickly that shift has started to gain momentum since it started. And another thing I find surprising about resilience is how that word has become common currency in so many domains. I was at a garden party last night at the New Zealand High Commission here in Vanuatu, and the president of Vanuatu was there, and the foreign secretary for development from the EU, and there are a bunch of people, and I counted 4 different speakers used the word resilience in their presentations about making communities more resilient and resilient development, and it's become a real buzzword. I hesitate to say that because I think it has real meaning as a word, but it has become a word that a lot of different sectors have adopted.
Yeah, which I find really fascinating as well, but part of my question, my problem with that is, if a word becomes really used in general conversation in just about every kind of field,
Yeah.
how do we pin down a meaning as to what resilience actually is?
Yeah, I think that's really hard, and particularly, I was talking to someone last night about sustainable agriculture and talking about communities here where people really are living hand to mouth, and they were saying, "Oh yeah, we want to make these people more resilient through our programs." And my first instinct was to say impossible, which is actually wrong. I was wrong in that instinct. But my first instinct was, by definition, the purest term of resilience is bouncing back after being, leveled by trauma or setback. And I was thinking, well, if you really are living hand to mouth in a sustainable like eating what you grow, and you get wiped out by Cyclone Pam, then it's a very difficult situation to be agriculturally resilient. So yeah, back to your point about how you create some sort of common meaning for this concept across sectors. I think that's really hard. And even within psychology, I've seen people adopt this word and blow the definition out past what a purist would like. So when I first started working with this, everybody was going resilience, and they started to use it to mean a much broader thing than what the actual root of the word means, which is that to bounce back following trauma. And I think even within psychology, resilience has really come to mean, I think, 2 things. One is that bounce back aspect, so following trauma and setback, that ability to get back on track and come back. But the other broader, I think, meaning has to do with sustainability. So the ability to meet challenges and to persevere in the face of challenges. And that aspect of what people now talk about as resilience, I think really is actually more well-being and flourishing. But the word resilience has come to be, rightly or wrongly, the umbrella term for those two things, that sustainability and that recovery aspect.
So do you think that in terms, say, look, let's look at the field of psychology for a start, but do you think it's kind of like a term that is looking for a clear definition at the moment? It hasn't quite reached the point of being across the sector, psychological sector, to be able to say, okay, we can now define resilience, or are we still in the process of doing that?
I think I think the way most people use it, it does have a clear definition. I just think that that definition is broader than what the word was ever intended to bear. And I think that there is a clear consensus now, generally, that when people use the word resilience, they're really talking about flourishing, more broadly. So that aspect of sustainability plus that aspect of recovery, that ability to recover. And I think they're two different, although related with overlap, concepts. So I think the purists would insist no, resilience is just this. But I do think, yeah, I do think most people do understand that when people say resilience, they're looking at this sort of more broadly in terms of flourishing, well-being, happiness type of thing.
It almost sounds like the way in which we're psychologically defining resilience is developing and growing in the same way that when you and I both started looking at stress and trauma, it's come a long way in 20 years in terms of defining what is stress and what is trauma. We've come up with a whole series of subsets and groupings and different kinds of definitions. Is that kind of what you see happening with the process of resilience as well?
That's what I see happening with this field in general. And I mean, I personally would prefer if there was a broader term like well-being or flourishing that was becoming the buzzword, but that's just not happening. So getting on board with the resilience train and just going, okay, this is going to have this broader meaning, this broader definition. I just get on board with that and understand that we're really, I think, talking about flourishing.
But you use the word sustainability. Does it start with sustainability? Is that a foundation that you build flourishing on? I mean, how do you see those two working together?
I think there is a lot of overlap, but I do think it does start with the qualities that feed into sustainability. So if you don't have some baseline level of those qualities that equip you to cope well with challenges in the first place, then it's much harder for you to bounce back when you do get leveled by those challenges. So I guess I do see the sustainability aspect of it as primary, I guess, and the recovery aspect of it as somewhat, not completely, but somewhat a natural outflow of those qualities that help you persevere, help you cope in general.
So is resilience in the broad term, the sustainability plus flourishing, is that something that human beings grow up with, they have as like an inherent ability, or is it a tendency that we have to work on? How do you see that?
I think it's both. I think there's many aspects of what make people resilient that come as part of your genetic package, your genetic makeup. So let's take, for example, a genetic bent towards optimism. Mm-hmm. Some of us are just born more optimistic than others. And being optimistic is a really strong quality that does make you more resilient in general. And so that's a good example of something that I think is partly genetic, partly genetic, but it's also something that you can work on. So what do optimists do? They see the good in life. They have an ability they expect the good in life. They think the future, they think positively about the future. They tend to think more positively about the past. They express and embrace positive emotion more. And there's many aspects of those sorts of things that people can practice and learn to do, no matter what your natural bent is. And so it is, I think, both and. Like, some people are ahead of the curve on what makes people naturally resilient, but there's a lot of skills and qualities associated with resilience that anyone can identify and nail down and practice. And incorporate them into part of their daily lives and routines. And as you do those sorts of things, I think that reshapes you slowly over time. Just the way if you exercise, you get more fit. It's the same with some of these positive psychology, I guess, exercises that orient you towards gratitude and mindfulness and help you see the positive, and they can really reshape your outlook on time and create this positive upward spiral.
So we can learn how to become optimists is essentially what you're saying. There's a process that I could go through to become more optimistic.
Yes, I think that's a good way of saying it. There are skills and qualities we can practice that will help us become more optimistic.
Does this also mean that if I wanted to look back in the past and things that had happened to me, I may have, if I'm a pessimist, I may have looked at those and said, well, of course I was doomed all the way along because look at what happened to me, or look at the way I responded. But I could, if I wished to, I could look at those memories and I could begin to say, well, actually there were some good things that came out of that.
Yes, or assign different meanings to those memories, or work with those memories to integrate them more into your life story. I don't think it's all about, positively reinterpreting what happened to us and trying to convince ourselves that, that was actually a good thing, or, I know you know all about nuance. I've read your books and you're a master at capturing the nuance in situations. So the nuance in these sort of situations of going, okay, there are many different ways we can approach the hard things that have happened to us in the past. And one of them is that negative interpretation, and that subtly influences your expectations for the future as well. But there are many different ways we can seek to work with those experiences and also seek to reshape, identify how we are looking at the future and interpreting what's happening to us on a daily basis, and seek to reshape that as well.
Some people use the word hope when they're talking about, resilient personalities, people who have hope for the future, hope in human beings or hope in themselves. That is a character. Is that connects to optimism as well? Are they connected?
I would think so. I think that optimistic people are naturally probably more hopeful, have more of that natural sense of good things will happen in the future. People are generally good. Good things will happen to me. Things will get better. I can make a difference. That sort of stuff that I think is all associated with hope. But I think even pessimists, or those of us who are not bubbly, overflowing bubbly optimists all the time, I think even pessimists can also have hope for the future. I think maybe it's just not quite so pervasive, or it doesn't come quite so naturally.
Right.
I don't know. It's a great question. It's almost a spiritual, theological question, that one.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because there does seem to be, in conversations that I've had, that some people need to refer to words like spirituality in terms of resilience, in a sense. And I wonder whether the word spirituality is being used in the same sense that you and I started off this discussion talking about resilience.
Yeah.
It's a really big thing, and we haven't really nailed it down, but somehow it seems to make a difference to how resilient people are.
I think it really does. If you think about the different key pillars of resilience, and I can think of probably at least four. One would be at some baseline level of physical fitness and health. Another would be self-efficacy, so that sense of generally feeling competent and confident, that you have the skills to deal with life's challenges, that you can make a difference in life. And then a third would be, I think, what's closely tied to what you were just talking about, which is a sense of meaning and purpose, and a sense of being involved in something that's bigger and more important than just yourself. And it does really seem to be a key thing in resilience, this sense of we're playing on a bigger team than just our own small lives, and that what we do matters, and that we're making some sort of contribution to something that is bigger than just ourselves.
So then, if we were to move to look at the other side of resilience, the question of what takes it away from us, using those four principles, would you see if a degradation of any or all of those four, it would be kind of the process that reduces someone's ability to be resilient?
Yeah, I think a degradation in any of those four key areas, and the fourth that we didn't just mention just now is relationships and the importance of relationships and social support. But so if you think about those, like you think about the impact that chronic pain, for example, has on somebody's innate resilience and all the things we've been talking about, optimism, hope, and general ability to deal with life. Or if you think about in the self-efficacy domain, unemployment, or like a severe blow to your sense of self-efficacy and your capabilities, your sense of yourself as a capable being, or if you strip somebody of the sense that what they're doing matters, and they just feel that what they're doing doesn't really matter to anybody or anything, or you strip them of most of their meaningful social contacts. Like I think a single blow, a single massive blow, pervasive and enduring blow in any of those areas is a severe blow to a person's, I guess, the amount of energy and capability they have in their resilience tank that fuels that resilience.
Back in the days of the Kosovo crisis, that's 15, 20 years ago now, I heard a number of eminent mental health professionals arguing that pretty much all of the population of the former Yugoslavia was going to need deep psychotherapy in order to be able to recover from the trauma of the civil war.
Yep.
But they didn't. I mean, they didn't get it because there are not enough psychotherapists to do that. But on another level, they didn't actually need it. So, and also interacting with refugees and people who've survived major natural disasters, the majority of people don't seem to need really, really intense psychotherapy. Is that an example of resilience?
Yes. I mean, if you talk about the ability to bounce back after your life, the rug has been ripped out from under you and you've taken really, really nasty blows in some of those critical domains that we were just talking about, the ability to come back from that and to move forward in a meaningful way over time, I think absolutely is an example of resilience. And I think also a good example of the fact that most people are resilient to quite an astonishing level, really, over time. And that even when we take those severe blows, you hear about people who are becoming quadriplegics or chronic, like so when you take a severe blow in one of those critical domains, it does really knock you sideways. And most people come back to a level that's sometimes incomprehensible from the outside to those who aren't experiencing it themselves. And I think it's a startling testament to the natural power of resilience, and that people will find a way to work with these traumas, because I think what happened to people in Kosovo at the time was a trauma. Like it really, they would have feared for their lives. It was a very, very big thing, but it does speak to the fact that many people don't need the Western model of psychotherapy to recover from these traumas, that inherent within the community and all the support from friends and families that they have, and just their own natural resilience, that they did work towards creating a new normal and embracing that and moving in new rich experiences and moving forward in that way.
You've got a stellar career in writing, and you've told stories that from my perspective, I look at it and I say these are stories about resilient people going through some really tough times. Does the telling of stories help us in terms of developing a sense of meaning and optimism? I mean, if I'm telling my own story in that kind of way, does that help the storytelling?
I think it does. Almost. I mean, I always hesitate to say it helps everybody, because chances are, it doesn't help everybody. I will go so far as to say I think it helps almost everybody, and it's definitely helped me. Telling stories has been a critical part of how I've worked through some of the really thorny issues that have threatened my resilience. The most recent example of that, about 4 years ago, when we were living in northern Laos, we had just had our first child, and my mother-in-law and father-in-law were visiting, and she slipped on the stairs in our house and she fell, and my 5.5-month-old baby's femur was broken. And this was a really, really big deal. We were a long way away from a hospital. It took us 30 plus hours to get to the hospital in Bangkok. And it was probably the worst day of my life, that very long 2-day span that it took us to get Dominic to the hospital. And he's fine now. And he was treated well. He was fine. But I found that event really, really traumatic as a first-time mother, and just being so far away from help. And for a very long time, I couldn't even talk about it. I think the first time I tried to talk about it publicly was in front of a group of mothers, and I was giving a speech on postnatal anxiety, which was really not where I should have decided that, yes, I could unpack this story publicly, because actually I started to talk about it and found that I couldn't unpack this story publicly. And much to my surprise, in retrospect, it's so obvious, but I was like, I couldn't even talk about it on stage. And it was after that, and it was probably about another year before I decided I actually have to tackle this face to face. And the way I chose to do that was by writing about it. And I wrote an essay about suffering, and I talked about this event and other things that have happened to us in the last 5 years, and how my views on suffering have changed in the last decade. And that essay took me, I don't even know, about 4 weeks to write. It's only about 2,000 words long, and it took forever. But the process of writing that essay, of forcing it out and going over and over the story and how it related to how my views on suffering have changed, and my thoughts about resilience and hope. And I mean, the title of the essay was Good Will Come. So the place where I landed was, good will come out of these things. And I don't have to feel like that good outweighs these things, or negates these bad things. And I can still say, if I could undo that fall in Laos, I would do it in a heartbeat. But I can now look at the good that has come out of that and acknowledge that. And writing that story, I think, freed me from the trauma to a certain extent of that incident. And I really noticed a shift in that particular area where I think I, for a long time, wasn't resilient. I was really stuck in what had happened. So for me, writing has been really powerful. And I do think, to come back to your broader point about storytelling, that when we can tell our stories, particularly about our deepest hurts and wounds, and we can draw some broader meaning or link them to our broader life story, or just tell them without getting completely stuck, that does help. That really does help. Yeah.
There's a couple of things that I think you said were there really important to me. Was this, you named the story with the really strong statement that good is at the end of the story. And so one of the things I've heard about is that if we ruminate on something that has happened to us for a long time without getting to the good will come of it, then that's the place where we're stuck.
Yeah.
But maybe somehow the ruminating is the part that goes through our minds as we are trying to create the story that we can tell that's going to end up with the good will come out of it. I don't know. I mean, you're a fiction writer as well as a professional writer, and I would guess that part of your job as a fiction writer is ruminating on a story that you want to tell.
Yeah. And it took a long time for me to be willing or able to tell this particular story. So it's 4 years, basically, before I could face this one. And for me, I think another important part when you're talking about the rumination, I think I always recognized that there was some good that came. But the point that was tripping me up, that I realized as I was writing this piece, was that I got really angry about the fact that I was like, the good isn't worth it, damn it. Like, that's not enough good to justify this. Like, it's and many of the as someone who grew up in the church, many of the Christian cliches that get trotted out at times like this of all things work together for good, and many of the things that well-meaning people say during times of crisis of like, God won't give you more than you can handle, and that stuff like that did not help me. That sort of stuff really tripped me up, and I think that the part that I particularly worked through in writing this essay was that unhooking the good from the trauma, and being able to let them both be separate, like related but separate, and saying, this thing was horrible. I still wish it had never happened. I still wish I could go back and undo that, but also recognizing that was never my choice. That was never my decision to make. And then also being able to say, these are the good things that have come out of that incident. Watching my husband help us through that incident, deepen my respect and affection for him, and it's influenced relationships in other good ways. And saying, I don't think this good outweighs the bad, but it doesn't have to anymore. And I think that there was a freedom in being able to unhook that and sort of let go of the anger of feeling like you needed to balance these cosmic scales. And I think everybody's tripping point is different. For different stories. That was mine for this story. And it was only through telling the story that allowed me to name that and then to let it go.
Yeah, but it sounds important because the point about that whole question that we all ask ourselves as we get older, if I had not done that, or if I had made that left turn instead of a right turn, or if I hadn't been doing this, or if I'd only done that, then this wouldn't have happened. Is where we get ourselves stuck, isn't it? And if we keep on going around in that, then we're stuck in that event, and it actually comes to own us.
Yeah. And I think an important thing to think about when you can face it is to try to figure out, like, why am I stuck? Like recognizing you are stuck and then going, what is pushing my buttons at this point? Like, what is helping keep me here? And there are so many different vehicles that people find useful to help process this, and it's just that writing and storytelling has been a really powerful vehicle for me, and in terms of personal resilience. But I know people who can get at that effectively through art or other there does seem to be something about the value of creativity in helping us come at these stuck points. And for me, it's with words, and other people, it might be different.
Yeah, so you might see people who sing or play music or create artworks or go and do something for other people. That kind of what we would term the altruistic kind of humanitarian approach. I think there's some research that shows that we're looking at social workers in North America, and a significantly higher percentage of social workers came from difficult backgrounds as children than the general population, but they're doing good work. In a sense, it's creating something or other that has hope and optimism out of their background.
They're taking some of their pain and channeling it towards something good. I will say, though, that I think that there is something potentially more powerful and more targeted about telling our stories than some of these other things, which I think are also good, in that I think it's pretty hard to weasel out of confronting something when you set yourself the task of telling the story and really trying to unpack the meaning behind it. And I'm not implying that social workers with painful backgrounds are weaseling out of identifying their trauma points, but I think we can tuck stuff away and not face it and channel ourselves into doing good or practicing gratitude or whatever, and just not touch that sore spot. And maybe sometimes that's okay, and then sometimes we actually need to try to dig out the roots of what it is that in this particular area. And
it
I think
takes a lot of courage, doesn't it, and bravery to actually turn and face those stories that we have lived through. I mean, it's a hard thing to do on your own, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think that's a great therapist can be a real asset in that, to have somebody ask you questions and gently sort of help be with you as you walk that path would be a big benefit. I like to do it with writing because it takes it takes me 40 hours to unpack something like Dominic's broken leg, and writing an essay is a lot cheaper than therapy, which is not to say that therapy would also not be effective. But yes, writing essays is not for everybody.
But maybe a good friend who knows us well could fill part of that role of helping us pay attention to the things we need to pay attention to.
Yeah. And I think talking through these things, particularly if you don't like to write, that's the same aspect of storytelling. And also there has been so much research that show that generally, not always, that act of telling the story, especially if you tell it repeatedly, that it loses some of its intensity. It loses some of that hold over you that makes you choke up and get stuck and feel frozen and right back in that moment.
Does this? You talked about the way in which your relationship with your husband was deepened and strengthened because of, as you both went through this event. Do you think that is also the kind of thing that happens to groups of survivors of, events, whatever that might be, and how they may not have even known each other at the start of this incident, but at the end of it, they feel like they've got this common story that they now share?
I think it's a dynamic. I'm not sure it's one any of us would choose to form bonds, but I think it does work like that often. I think sometimes if you go into crisis and come through crisis with a basic orientation of respect and affection, and that you see things during that crisis that increase that respect and affection, I think that's the trajectory through which bonds are strengthened. I think bonds can also be broken by experiences under pressure as well. But yes, I do think there is something about going through an intense experience can fast track those relational bonds, and the intensity of those shared memories and experiences really can create a group cohesiveness and build relationships fast, which is a huge factor that feeds into resilience. When you think about the importance of relationships to us as a species, we are just hardwired to be in relationship, to love others and to feel that we are loved and respected. And so those can be that can be a really massive silver lining to going through something, in a supportive relationship or a group of relationships.
I was struck by that in northern Jordan. I spent some time in the Al-Zatari refugee camp, refugees from Syria coming across the border into Jordan, 100,000 people in a huge refugee camp. And the question of mental health of refugees was raised. And people were puzzled at the apparent resilience of those in the camp. But people who hadn't known each other and were refugees began to form quite strong relationships through this shared experience of having to leave their own country and set up camp in another country. And somehow it was almost like a community was developing where there hadn't been a community before. And it struck me when you said about relationships that something about social support is really critical to me retaining my optimism and hope for the future. Is that what you would say as well? The social support part, the networking, the telling the story is one thing, but do you need an audience for the story?
That's such a good question. I mean, I think if you just take it back to what we were just talking about with writing, I think that writing of that essay would have been cathartic and healing for me, regardless of whether anybody read it. But I think it was more cathartic and healing for me because it was then read by people that were close to me and by many, many people that were not close to me. And the empathy and responses that I got back to that only helped push that process along. So there were so many people that said some version of like, wow, it's great to read this. This has been my journey too, and thank you for putting this into words. And so... yeah, I do think there is something pure and inherent in storytelling, but I don't know if we would be as motivated, or what would be the broader point of storytelling if there wasn't some network within which those stories were told.
So the social component then of the story that you told was, in terms of the growth or the development since that time, was an important component for you. I mean, there's the cathartic part of having told the story and got to an end, but there's this added benefit of
Yeah.
what you got from others who read the story.
Exactly, and the same thing happened with the first novel that I wrote when I was in my 20s. I wrote this book. I just decided I would write a novel about I wanted to write a novel about teenagers who go on mission trips and then have terrible things happen and their world falls apart, and basically their whole conception of who God is and how the world works is changed in an instant by what they experience overseas. And I wanted to write that book because that question really confused me. Like, how do you reconcile the age-old question of terrible things happen in this world? I've been raised to believe in a good God. I'm having a really hard time bringing those two things together. So that's why I wrote this novel. And it took me about 10 years to write it. And I did just write it for me. I didn't even know if it would ever get published. And so in its pure form, like just having written that story probably helped me sort that out. But then again, after it was published, and again, the same sort of feedback of, wow, this is really put into words. And so it is that added benefit, that silver line, that extra stuff, I guess, that's been, yeah. And all of that only encouraged me more in my vision of myself as a writer and a storyteller. So you see how these things all sort of feed in together in a positive upward spiral that has become something that is so central to my own personal resilience. And, one question, is there something in your own life that you see a similar thing where you have a natural bent to a certain quality or an activity that promotes resilience, but then there have been other things that have come in that have created this positive upward spiral that's made that more valuable to you than it already would have been?
Yeah, so it's interesting because it sounds to me, the intent of writing that first book and the intent of writing the essay about your son's broken bone were not actually to satisfy an audience.
No.
The intent was for you to write the story so that it made sense to you. However, by sharing it with an audience, you've now got this fairly extensive social network, this community, if you like, of people who, to some extent, they form part of your social resilience support, don't they?
Absolutely, and they've all absolutely sort of fed into, they've helped promote my sense of self-efficacy, I guess. My Australian heritage and innate modesty sort of make me cringe to say this sort of stuff, but that sort of positive feedback has helped me go, wow, I'm a writer. I'm a good writer. I tell stories people want to listen to, and that sense of confidence in my ability as a writer has also made me more resilient and helped me become more confident in this is a skill that I can use to help me make sense of life, and that will help make me more resilient. That will help me flourish. And I would love to know from your life, is there a similar area, whether exercise or research or whatever? And this is such an interesting question that we've sort of stumbled upon, of what is something in your life that you already had an innate talent for, but that has been nurtured and encouraged by experiences that have happened as a result of using that talent?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For me, and the reason we're doing this is because people have been telling me for a long time that I'm quite good at holding conversations.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, that was just something I enjoyed doing, but actually, it's something I enjoy doing, and people have said I'm quite good at these conversations, and I thought, well, that's interesting. Let's have some fun having conversations, and which is where kind of the resilience interview comes from, in a sense. And I'm thinking that part of what you said there was the affirmation of your ability to tell a story. The affirmation of my ability to hold conversations is a critical part for our own sustainable resilience and our flourishing, isn't it? That somehow that affirmation from external points makes a big difference. And I was thinking, in terms of when people are, whether they're functionally disabled, or socially disabled, like they're refugees in a refugee camp, or they're psychologically disabled because something's happened to them. One of the worst things, the worst messages they can be told is actually you don't have anything to contribute.
Yeah.
And that message that you don't have anything to contribute actually chips away at our resilience.
Yeah.
Is that what you would think? It knocks it
I
back?
think from a couple of different angles, like that attacks that self-efficacy related to confidence and skills and capability. It also attacks that that foundational sense of meaning. If you don't have anything to contribute, if you don't have anything to say that is worth listening to, then what does it matter? And then also that if that's a consistent message that you're getting, then your relationships are also not feeding you. So it's such a destructive thing from at least three angles.
And so part of the thing that we've got to be careful about is the labelling, isn't it? I remember working with survivors of sexual abuse, and the one thing that they really were adamant about is don't call me a victim. You know, and I wonder sometimes whether, you know, the label refugee is diminishing in a sense. It's a descriptive term, but the moment it's applied, then a whole series of social processes occur that wouldn't occur to people who were, say, travellers.
Yeah.
Or expats, or people who are changing countries, or whatever. It's and you've got a label now as writer,
Yeah.
you know, as well as mental health expert, as well as mother and wife and all the rest of it. But that label writer feeds into your sustainability by
Yeah.
itself.
Absolutely. And so, gosh, that's such an interesting point you raise about the label refugee. And part of me goes, I wonder what if you got 1,000 refugees together and you ask them what they would say about that, about the necessity of having such a label to access services and help. But at the same time, I would guess what that speaks to is a call to get better at labeling other things that can help counteract some of the negative stereotypes associated with other labels we wear. So getting better at identifying people's strengths and what they can contribute, and calling out their stories, and broadening our picture of who people are, so that it's not just reduced to one label.
Yeah, well, it's actually my intention to ask some refugees about that labelling thing, and whether they find it useful for their you know, who they are and they're looking to the future, or whether they find it unuseful. I think the thing that struck me most of all about it, and why it's a topic in my mind, is that in Jordan, Syrian nationals are legally entitled to come and go from the country as and when they wish. They're entitled to set up businesses, they're entitled to send their kids to local schools, they're entitled to buy and rent property. So there's a whole group of Syrians who have come across to Jordan who are running businesses in various cities, and then there's another group of Syrians who are in a camp, and they have the label of refugee. And it sort of struck me, this is interesting. You know, it's like that old, you know, the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that old movie of, you know, you've got the medical staff on one hand and you've got the patients on the other in this mental institution, and who's crazy? It's like, you know.
Yeah, that would be fascinating to figure out. Yeah, it's a different, somewhat unique situation as well, because the refugee situations in Africa, many of them are not like that. But that's a very good distinction that you draw. Would a different word or would a different approach be beneficial to those populations, or are they benefiting in other ways from some of the protections that go along with that label refugee, and some of the recognition of the trauma that shoved them across the border, these ones in the camp? I have no idea.
No, I was thinking in terms of, you know, like, so maybe one of the things I need to do is to listen carefully at how people describe themselves.
Yeah.
You know, if someone says to me, I am not a victim of sexual abuse, I am a survivor, I'm not disabled, then I need to listen to that and heed that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think the act of making that statement says to them, this is an important part of my own image around this issue, and that this sense of I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor is a really key piece of my own story that's given me strength. And I think recognizing that and respecting that when people speak to that is so key.
Well, we're coming towards the end, and I know I've taken you all over the place, Lisa, and I just wondered whether there was any things that you had thought about prior to us talking that you wanted to say in the interview, and I want to make sure that don't go totally off script.
I can hardly even remember now. It was great to refresh some of my work on resilience, because I hadn't looked at that in a month or two as I was working on other projects. I think it's such an interesting area that and it's just not just interesting for mental health professionals. It's just interesting for humans to think about this whole issue of strength and flourishing, and what helps us flourish and what helps me flourish, and are there things that I can be practicing and doing that will make a big difference, strategic points of influence in my life. And so I guess I would just encourage people this is such an interesting area to dive into, and there's a lot of accessible books out there on that. I've read recently Martin Seligman's Flourish, which is, I think, pretty accessible, but also really rich in research and detail, and makes quite a convincing case for some of the pillars of resilience, and gives you some really good things that you can do to follow through to start to practice some of these disciplines that will make you more resilient. So I guess I would just say I'm so pleased to see different areas, regardless of the muddiness of the definitions and stuff, heading in this direction where we look to the positive and celebrate that and build on that. And I think it's a fascinating interview series that you're doing, and I really look forward to watching some of the other videos too.
Yeah. Oh, no, thank you. I would actually like to talk to economists about what a resilient economy is. I'd like to talk to ecologists about what makes a resilient ecology, because all those areas have the word resilience in them, and it would be very interesting to get their perspective to say, okay, we're talking about an economy. What's the resilient economy? How does that work? How do you define it? So, thank you for that, and I'm really pleased that you can be part of the series, and I hope you enjoy watching the other videos as well. We'll put up, at the end of the video, we'll put up some of the references that you've talked about, and others as well that people might like to go to as well. But and I'd really encourage people to read your books, Lisa, because they're really, really good. I'm biased. But thanks. But thank you very much for today, and go well.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John.